Okay, I'll wait for a second to get a confirmation from my team that everything was good. And in the meantime, I encourage all of you who took a moment of your lunch break, depending on which time zone you're in, to spend it and learn more about the data management and data knowledge competition, which is very unique in the sense that it's aimed only for jobs based in Luxembourg. But that's something we're going to talk about. So I'll wait a little bit to be sure that you can hear me, see me properly, and the slides and everything else. So hopefully it's all smooth, and we are going to get started. Why don't you put into the chat box where you are dialing in from? That's our usual ritual, and we want to be sure that we see how diverse geographically and otherwise diverse our participants and audience is. Brussels, Luxembourg, Greece, Germany, Sweden, Portugal. All right, from many, many places, Greece, Romania, Madrid, Netherlands. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for being here. As always, you are encouraged and you are welcome to put questions into the chat box, which the team will help to review and pass it on to me so I can answer as many as possible without being distracted by other conversations that may be happening over there. And then in terms of the technical side, hopefully the audio and everything will work very smoothly. If there's any concern, you can just restart your browser, or you could use it on your phone or other device, but then you will need the event code. If you have such a concern, write down the event code so you can easily dial in and enter that. This webinar is going to be recorded. I'm going to come back to it in a second. Here's a slide about my background. Many of you might know my work, that I've been with EU training for almost 20 years by now. And I am the author of the Ultimate EU Textbook, which has been in publication since 2005, that helps candidates like yourselves prepare for EPSO competitions. And then if you're interested, you're more than welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share all sorts of stuff, not just EU career related. So with that, as I was saying, today's presentation will be recorded, is being recorded. So you will get the recording afterwards, and you will also get the slides that I'm presenting here. But definitely you are welcome to ask questions, which is something that the live participants can benefit from, and also getting this information firsthand. And besides that, you will also be able to send messages to the support team through our contact form, and we'll be happy to point you to the right resources or answer any question related to the exam the best we can. And here comes the usual point with the disclaimer that we are not EPSO. We are not the European Personnel Selection Office. We are an independent company, but definitely we've been in the business long enough to understand the context in which the competitions happen and understand certain bits and pieces which may not be obvious by simply reading the notice of competition. So with that, let's get started with a few words about our company. Like I said, we have a great community of candidates and former candidates who may again be candidates, because once you are in an EU job, it doesn't mean you no longer want to enroll in competitions. Sometimes to jump a grade a little faster than the natural progression of your career, or because you are in an ASD position, but you qualify for an AD, an administrator position, or for any other reason for that matter. So on Facebook, there is a robust community. If you're on Facebook, you're welcome to join it. Please follow us on LinkedIn. We are increasingly present there, and we share there some promotions and breaking news and similar items. And then with the test packages and the other resources, we have a huge database of multiple choice questions, along with preparation tools and webinars. Many are free, some are paid. And there are also many training courses and workshops and coach instructor-led workshops that you may want to check out. So with that, let's get started with today's competition. So the EPSO 8426/25, 25 obviously refers to the year that we are in. And 426 is just a reference number of this particular competition. And one very particular angle of it that I briefly mentioned, and all of you certainly have seen, is that this competition is very specific to Luxembourg. So Luxembourg-based positions. It's not from the Luxembourgish government. It is not from any other entity. These are European institutions who will eventually do the recruitment but the place of work is in Luxembourg. And part of the reason, and again, it's not in the notice of competition, but to give you a little bit of context for those of you who are perhaps new to this area and new to European careers, the reason why Luxembourg is so unique is because it's more expensive. And it's not obvious that those who want to work for EU institutions are immediately ready or willing to move to Luxembourg and take up employment there. And that is sometimes a problem because they run a competition, and then the candidates, when they learn that the job is in Luxembourg, they may not be so willing to take up a certain vacancy or fill a certain vacancy. So they decided that, okay, let's be very upfront and transparent about it. And when you apply, you need to be fully aware that the job, the place of employment, will be in Luxembourg as a country, or Luxembourg City on the Kirchberg, more specifically, where most European institutions are located. So with that, this is an 87 position. In the end, the competition itself is aimed to create a reserve list. And in the end, when you are hired, when you are recruited, that's in an 87 position. There are 238 places on the reserve list, and that means there's no guarantee of employment for all the 238 individuals who will be listed on the reserve list. And that is for good reason. Sometimes your life circumstances change. Sometimes maybe the offered position is not something that you want to accept. Now, of course, that's not an ideal situation, having gone through the exam and having invested time and effort into your preparation. But again, this is to say that sometimes just life happens, and not everyone on a list will be hired in the end. What the actual proportion is very hard to tell because it is subject to the vacancies that are being published. But of course, and that's the upside and that's the good news, but of course, it's not for nothing that they come up with this number, that there are 238 positions, because EPSO, when it launches a new competition, it will have consulted its client institutions, be that the European Commission, be that the European Parliament, be that the European Court of Auditors, be that the Court of Justice, whichever institution can hire from this reserve list will have been consulted and their input taken into account, and to say, okay, this is how many vacancies we're expecting to fill in the next year or two. Therefore, they would come up with this number of how many places on the reserve list will be offered. And I see that how long you stay on the list. Well, you stay on the list forever in a practical sense, but the more legally accurate question is, how long is the list valid? And typically a list is valid for a year, but that should not scare you, because when the expiry nears, if, and again, it's not always the case, but if it's a 1 year validity and the expiry is getting near, and they see that, oh, there's still a large number of people on the list, well, then they extend it by another year. And sometimes the validity is from the beginning upfront, they say it's for 2 years. So the list is valid for a relative, let's say, enough time to be hired from it for those who want to be hired, and then on the institution side for the vacancies to be filled up, the ones that they had foreseen. So that is usually not a concern, that a list expiry would come too quickly, or that you may be expunged from the list for one reason or another. So once you're on the list, you can be hired. And then where will you work? In Luxembourg. And well, I used to live 3 years in Luxembourg, so it was a very, very rich 3 years of my life, and it was a very interesting experience. I worked at the Court of Justice there. And again, there's a lot to say about what it means to live in Luxembourg, and the cost of living, and the social side, and whether you have kids or not, and all those very human part of it. So that is something you might want to consider when you say, okay, am I willing to move there? Am I willing or to move nearby? And then you commute from France or from Germany. There are many practical considerations to it. This is perhaps beyond the scope of today's workshop or today's webinar, but if you have one or two questions along those lines, happy to provide my take. Now, going back to the particularities of the competition, the relocation minimum stay. So, like I said, you need to be there. And I mentioned that whether you can live in France or Germany or nearby places and commute, that needs to be properly checked, because often they would have a certain limit of how far you can live from the place of work and how far you need to be able, or how many times a week you need to be physically present in the office. So you may not have the luxury of living a little further afield, perhaps with lower real estate prices. But again, Luxembourg is the place where you need to be present. And then there are certain limitations on the practical side. You say minimum 3 years before transfer within Luxembourg is allowed. So basically, you need to spend a certain number of years, which is 3, before you can move to another post. So inside Luxembourg, so from one institution or another, or from one post to another. So there is this restriction, which in other cases, it's usually 2 years. And in this case, it's 3 years. So that's kind of, dare I say, the price of certain benefits that you will get as a result of this particular position. And then minimum 4 years before essentially moving out of Luxembourg and going to elsewhere. There could be exception, there could be some reasons, but it can be very delicate. And again, this is about setting your expectations. When you say, okay, I'm going to go to Luxembourg, I'm going to do everything I can, not only to pass the competition, but to find employment with one of the European institutions on the basis of this reserve list. But then you need to know that you need to spend there 4 years, and not to count on that particular exception, but need to spend there 4 years before you can consider or you can apply for other positions, perhaps in Brussels or elsewhere. And then the final bit is certainly the usual, the default way these things operate, which is that the sending and the receiving institutions, they all need to agree. So it's not like your boss says, okay, I let you go, but then the receiving institution says, well, I'm not willing to enter into those challenges, put it this way, administrative bureaucratic challenges of you not spending there 2, 3, 4 years before you can move to another institution or post. Okay, so that is hopefully pretty clear. And then when it comes to the relocation, so the assumption, the idea is that you're going to be moving to Luxembourg, you're not already working there. This is not an exclusion. So it's not like those who are already there cannot apply for this competition. It's more about how it affects the certain financial benefits that, or salary benefits or add-ons to your salary that you can get as a result of moving to Luxembourg. So there's an installation allowance for the moving and for getting settled. Then there's a daily subsistence allowance for the very beginning, for the first, I don't remember how many months, but 3, 4 months or so, where you get some extra money, essentially, to settle in and get your internet provider in your home and make sure that you buy some IKEA furniture and all the rest. And then the travel costs for moving to the duty station. And perhaps the most interesting one is not so much the removal. Yes, there is that, but the expatriation allowance or the expat allowance, which is a delicate topic. And trade unions inside the institutions and critiques outside the institutions. This is a common topic of contention because it's 16% of the base salary. So it's pretty significant, as you will see the rough estimate of your base salary. So it's an important amount. But then do you qualify for that or not? And for you to be able to qualify, you essentially need to move to Luxembourg. And there are rules and specifications as to how far away you move to Luxembourg. So whether you're in Maastricht and what's the distance, and whether you're in Brussels, that needs to be carefully viewed at, and how many years you spent in a certain place and then moving over to Luxembourg. So there are certain rules and basic factors for the calculation, whether you're eligible for this particular allowance, because it's an important amount, like we said, and it's something that you're going to be getting essentially throughout your entire career. So all benefits depend on individual circumstances, like I said, and there are very specific rules if you want to look into it more deeply in the staff regulations. So the EU staff regulations, and you can look it up yourself, or you can use Google's Notebook LM that you feed that into, and then ask questions from that AI tool and say, help me interpret these particular rules. Would I be eligible or not? And then what are you going to do? What is the job actually about? And certainly we're not talking about very specific vacancies. So that's an important distinction, where a competition is not for one concrete job. This is about you being selected to be placed on the reserve list for broadly these kind of jobs. And once there's a specific vacancy, that is when you are actually hired into a specific job, say in the European Commission, DG ABC, whichever it is, for unit AB, 1, 2, 3, whatever the denomination is, for a very specific vacancy. But of course, this is a specialist competition where you need to know certain things. You need to have the right kind of qualification and work experience, as we will see in a moment, and broadly around data management. So as you can see, sometimes it's about data engineering, data integration, like it's listed, all the way from transforming loading processes, data taxonomy, and metadata management, data security, and the privacy. So there are multiple angles of this particular domain of working with data and managing data, both in a technological sense and both in a procedural sense, and also to some degree legal sense. And these are important because these are the topics that you can expect to be covered in one of the tests at the competition. So that is something we're going to come back to. The domain-specific tests are essentially focusing on these areas, and they can focus on any and all of these. So it's not like just because you are a mathematician and you're excellent when it comes to crunching and analyzing data, or perhaps you are a lawyer and you've dealt with data privacy aspects, but you don't know so much about metadata cataloging or taxonomies or ontologies or what have you. So all of this is broadly the subject of the competition, and it can be the subject of those domain-specific tests that are part of the overall competition. So that is something I'm going to come back to. But this, as with every specialist competition, is often a delicate area. Why? Because you are coming from all sorts of backgrounds. You can have very different kinds of diplomas and degrees and qualifications that made you qualify for this competition and made you interested, and the very reason you are here today listening to this presentation. But it may not be relevant. It may not be 100% exactly what they are looking for, what they consider as a qualified profile or a qualified candidate or qualified work experience. So this is subject to the assessment of the selection board. So EPSO is the organization that essentially runs these competitions, that's ultimately responsible for organizing and managing and setting the rules. But for every competition, there is a so-called selection board. And selection board comprises of EU officials who often would need to make those judgment calls about a candidate's profile, work experience, whether it qualifies, whether it meets the criteria as mentioned in the notice of competition. So that particular angle is essentially you need to demonstrate by all the documents and whatever other proof you can provide is that your education and your work experience fully qualifies you for this competition. Before we look at that part, there are some generic or let's say broad or high level requirements that every candidate must meet. These are always the same, essentially having EU citizenship, so one of the 27 member states' citizenship, fulfilled military service requirements, if that is an obligation in your country of your citizenship, not of your residence, but your citizenship. And then meet the character requirements for the job, because there might be sensitive positions, there might be security clearance required. It's not always the case. I mean, actually, it's more the exception than the rule, but still, you need to have a proper track record. And then there are the specific requirements about languages. That's pretty straightforward. We're going to look at it in a moment. And there are requirements on qualifications and work experience. So that is where a certain degree of judgment from the selection board members comes into play, given the diverse nature or diversity of backgrounds and qualifications and education. So what are the language rules? Language rules, pretty clear. You need to know 2 languages. There's always a language 1, language 2. And language 1 is one of the EU's 24 official languages, which is considered to be mother tongue level. I could choose English. I could choose perhaps French. My French is fairly good, but I wouldn't necessarily say mother tongue level. So probably I wouldn't choose that. Hungarian is my mother tongue, so I can choose that. And again, I could choose Latvian for that matter, because it's independent of my country of origin, well, in terms of citizenship, or country of residence, which is Belgium. But I could speak it so well for whatever reasons, I can choose it. So it's not linked to your administrative or citizenry background. Any of the 24 official languages can be chosen. So if you're very comfortable in English, you can choose it regardless of where you might be coming from. And then there's language 2, which again can be any of the 24, but practically 23 languages because it cannot be the same as language 1. So any of the remaining ones. So I could choose Latvian and Portuguese, or Finnish and Bulgarian. Really any combination that you wish. Now, certainly there's a practical consideration to it, which is that you want to choose a language 1 in which you can process information quickly, that you can understand the multiple choice tests at a pretty good speed, quickly and accurately, and you can find the correct answer that you need to provide. So essentially, language 1 is somewhat passive, where you can read and understand, and language 2 is where you can express yourself in writing at greatest ease, because the written test part will be in language 2. So in terms of spelling, in terms of vocabulary, in terms of the sophistication of your written expression, that's a language 2 that you want to choose, where you can write well. So that consideration is perhaps the most practical side of it, aside from the broad formal terms. And then what are the education qualification parts and the work experience parts? And basically there are 3 scenarios, and it largely depends on what's your underlying degree and what sort of work experience you have. And not just what sort, but that the underlying degree will have an impact on how many years of work experience you are required to have. So if your university degree in an area, which again is good enough, so to say, for the competition, but it's not necessarily really at the heart of it, then you need 6 years of relevant professional experience. But if you have a 4-year degree, which again, there's a list of which topics or which areas are under that particular header. If you have 4 years, then you need fewer years of relevant work experience. And then the third scenario you have guessed. So you have then 3 years of degree in other areas, then you need 7 years of experience. So essentially, the topic/duration of your underlying degree has an impact of how many years of relevant professional work experience you are required to have to qualify. So that's a combination. And again, I don't want to necessarily say more than that, because certainly there are lawyers, there are statisticians, and there are data scientists and all sorts among you. So you need to look at your own situation in light of that particular provision in the notice of competition and say, okay, where does my qualification fit in? And then look at how many years of work experience you have. Now, if you have 10 years of work experience, it's not necessarily an immediate check mark on you qualifying for that particular requirement, because it needs to be relevant to the job. So maybe out of 10, you have 5 years that you spent in a certain role or doing tasks which are absolutely relevant to the task that or some of the tasks that are described in the notice of competition, right? And there is a provision on PhD, as you can see. So having a master's PhD meets the education requirement, right? Like even if you did something else, you did, I don't know, linguistics, but you ended up doing a PhD on data science, then that is a good thing because it qualifies you for that particular criteria. So again, the whole conversation around, am I qualified? Do I have the sufficient number of work experience? It's very individual. So that's why it's hard to say anything beyond that. Need to look at your profile. And even us, we try to be as helpful as we can, and we can guide you, we can give you feedback, we can give you advice. But ultimately, it's going to be the selection board that is going to have, or that does have the right, the ultimate say in deciding whether or not you qualify. And so to say, the frustrating bit, perhaps bad news, is that typically they would not do that before you actually apply and go through the various tests and exams, because you need to be confident enough that you have those in place, because they are almost certainly not going to tell you, if you send them a customer support message, actually, they're not going to tell you that, yeah, we guarantee that you qualify, because that what is the word, that review, that assessment, whether a particular candidate's profile fits the criteria and they say, yes, you're good to go, that happens much later in the process. So we have a beautiful flow chart on that. We're going to get to that of when it happens. But the bottom line is you will not get that security, or not even security. You're not going to get that certainty is the word I'm looking for. You're not going to get that certainty in advance before applying for the exam. They're not going to commit fully in a legally binding manner that, yes, you should apply for this competition because based on everything we see, you're good to go. No, they're going to say, well, that part is in the process at a later stage, so we can give you some guidance, but nothing that commits in a legally binding sense. Then a couple of points here on what diplomas are accepted. I mean, many. There are diplomas. Let's say AI is much more mainstream these days, but maybe 10 years ago, it was quite rare to have a degree in AI. So that's one area. Or machine learning was perhaps a term that was more broadly accepted and used. But then again, you have some classics like mathematics or statistics, but even European studies for that matter, or engineering, could qualify you for this competition, as long as you pass the different steps in the competition, as long as you are actually in you pass the different stages and different exams in the competition. And then some words on a professional experience. And it needs to be relevant, right? Like it has to match the duties described in Annex 2, a little snapshot of which I provided a couple of slides before. And there are this description of the typical duties that we briefly touched upon. So I'll pause here for a second. I see there are many questions coming in. So let me pick and choose a few before we move on. So Agnieszka is asking, is EU knowledge test in language 1 or in English only? There's no EU knowledge test. So your knowledge of how the European Union works is not tested in this competition. There is a field-related test, which we're going to look at in a moment. And it's not in English only, but it's any of the 24 languages based on your choice. So if you had chosen Polish, then you can sit that particular field-related test in Polish, just like you can sit other tests in the same language, except for the written one, which is in language 2. Anissa is asking, do we need to have proofs of these languages? No, there's no DALF, DELE, Oxford, TOEFL, what have you. None of this is needed. You don't need any certificate of your linguistic knowledge. You essentially need to be able to use it. And that's how you demonstrate your knowledge of that language. All right, Erkan is asking, if I pass the 87 competition, can I apply for an 85, 86? No, because the level of a competition, and in this case it's 87, determines the vacancies to which you can apply. So you can only apply them for 87 vacancies, even if there's an 85 or 86 where you would qualify. This kind of predetermines you. In this case, perhaps in a strangely paradoxical way, maybe it doesn't benefit you because you want to get a job and if you are happy to accept an 85, but it's an 87 level. So you need to get a job at an 87 level, or a vacancy at 87 level. 1 or 2, how long do you stay on the list? I answered that. Julian was the first to ask, will this competition be managed by the new external IT provider? So for those of you who are not following it so closely, there was, well, currently still is, a technical provider for the remotely administered testing of these competitions called TestWe, and now they have chosen a new provider, actually happens to be in Luxembourg, called OAT, which is being onboarded as we speak. Whether they're going to administer this new competition, chances are yes, because there is another competition that had been announced for building managers, which is probably coming up in a few months, perhaps weeks. And that is likely to be the first one where this new provider will be the technical provider, essentially, of the interface and of the whole management of the remotely administered competitions. And this one has just been announced, so it will take some time before the actual exam is announced. And that is likely going to be in the new year. And then probably the new provider will be the one in charge. And then last one, before we go back to the slides, what would actually happen if one is not staying these 4 years in Luxembourg? Well, presumably, you can always resign, of course, but that is not necessarily what you had in mind. But if you want to transfer while keeping your pay grade and keeping your administrative status unchanged, but moving to another post, whether it's inside Luxembourg, that's for after 3 years, or if you want to go elsewhere, say the Brussels is the most likely candidate for that, but maybe go to the Joint Research Center in Sevilla or ISPRA or other, that is after 4 years, unless there is an actual explicit agreement between your head of unit or the person in charge and the receiving end, the other person. But again, it's not something I would encourage you to count on. It can happen and it's in the rules for one reason or another, but as a main rule, you are required to stay there for 4 years. All right, if we could go back to the slides, we're going to look at why this is a great opportunity and tell you a few words about the benefits before we look at the building components of this exam. So there's health insurance. So it's a pretty generous and pretty comprehensive health insurance for EU officials. There are European schools. So if you have kids, they can go and study in their own mother tongue. And there are multiple ones, even in Luxembourg. And we follow the curriculum of the so-called home country. Now, of course, if your spouse is from a different country, that can give some flexibility into which one you want to choose. Again, has its own rules, like everything in the EU, but those are there. And certainly the salaries are an important and attractive part of this. Now, we have a salary calculator on our website. So if you want to play with that and check out based on different variables, kids or marital status and many other factors, how much that would be. So we did a simulation for you saying, assuming that you are eligible for the expat allowance, meaning you have moved into the job or moved to Luxembourg for that particular reason, you had not lived within a certain radius, whether it's 150 or 200 kilometers or more, how far essentially you are moving in from. And we said 87 salary step that is related to the number of years of work experience you have had and what the salary would be. The rough estimate, and again, is about 8,000 euros net monthly. Again, give or take, depending on certain factors. And like we said at the beginning, it's higher because there's this integration, moving, settling in allowance and some others. But it gives you an idea that even in Luxembourg, which is not the cheapest place in Europe, so to say, with some euphemism, but it's still a pretty competitive salary to get by. So with that, a couple of points on the very specific details. What does this competition look like? What are the different steps? So there's an application process where you essentially sign up, you create a profile if you don't have yet. If you have, then from a single candidate profile, you can then manage this. And then essentially you take the tests on the day, same for everyone, same day for everyone, and remotely. So that happens through your own computer, as long as you can install the software on that computer. And then there is the eligibility check. So this is what I had spoken about at the beginning. That's when they actually check your work experience, your degrees, and other declarations you have made to be sure that you are eligible for the competition. And then there's the reserve list. So the first step, very straightforward. There is the single candidate portal. You create an account unless you already have one. Not much to say about it. There's the application process. You can do that in any of these 24 official languages. For practical reasons, you might want to do it in English or French. But again, if you're more comfortable in Greek, then you can do it in Greek. No worries there. And upload a copy of your ID. So a couple of administrative steps. And then the application process, the most important date to bear in mind, 16 December, which is the deadline. And do not miss it, and rather finalize everything a couple of days before. And then the supporting documents, so be that your degree, be that your your certificate about employment or any other official document you can provide to prove your employment history, and also that you have the sufficient number of years of relevant work experience needs to be done by the 20th March. So that's good news because it gives you more time to get those documents. Maybe it was a job that you held 5 years ago and it takes some digging and some looking into to prove that you had held that particular position. Now, basically everyone who validates their application will be invited to sit the test. There's no pre-screening of any kind. You will be invited to take the test. And like I said, it's remotely and you need to install a software on your computer. So if you don't have administrators access or admin rights to your computer, then look into it, because you might need to get another computer or come to this beautiful space at Ambiorix Center in Brussels, where we offer this venue and this space. We have 4 and if need be, maybe even 5 slots where you can sit with secure internet and the proper equipment to sit the test. So that is available. And then if you don't complete the test, then you are disqualified from the competition. So you need to take each and every step, each and every exam you need to sit. They are not going to give you immediately the results. So you are going to sit through the entire thing, even if you think you messed up one of them or you're wondering, whatever you're wondering about, you need to go through the process, because that is the only case when they are going to evaluate, they're going to check your results. So what are the tests? And this is no surprise, essentially, for anyone who's ever set an EPSO competition. There are essentially 3 parts. One is the reasoning skills. The second one is the field-related multiple choice questions, and then the EU free text essay. So essentially the written test. Now, what are these? Basically, verbal, numerical, abstract reasoning, very classic. So these are the kind of tests that are or have been used for a very long time. One interesting bit is that the final score does not factor in the abstract, verbal, numerical reasoning results. So this is a pass-fail, and I say that in air quotes. You only need to pass or fail this competition, but the score above the pass limit is irrelevant. So whether you pass with 6 points or 10 points or whatever the total number of points is, it's irrelevant as long as you reach the minimum score. So verbal reasoning, very classic timing. And I say that classic because in almost all competitions, they use a similar proportion where you have 20 questions and 35 minutes to answer those questions with text passage, with question statements, 1 correct answer. And then numerical reasoning, 10 questions in 20 minutes. So this is often quite difficult given the calculation, the algebra you need to do, or data interpretation with reasoning, estimation, calculation. Or perhaps this is not such a heavy lift for those who are applying for data science and data management. So you are much more familiar and comfortable with numbers than perhaps other candidates in other competitions. And then comes the abstract reasoning, 10 questions in 10 minutes. Again, this is pretty tough, not so much for the challenge of finding the correct answer, but doing it 1 question per minute or 1 minute per question. So that is what makes it pretty challenging. Now, what's the scoring? There's a combined pass mark of the numerical and the abstract. So that you need 50% of the aggregate score, so you can mess up one and succeed perfectly in the other. So that's one option. Or there is the pass mark with the verbal, where again it's a 50% pass mark. Again, nothing particularly surprising for those who have tried other exams or other competitions. This is pretty standard, the way they calculate the scores and set up this exam. Now, the most challenging bit perhaps is really the field-related multiple choice quiz. So essentially based on all those areas and topics that were described early on, like I said, and it's in the notice of competition, where they will ask knowledge-based questions on that. So it's not so much on, hey, perform this particular task, but they can say, well, what is the quickest way of do that particular data manipulation in Excel? And then there will be multiple choice options, and you need to pick the one that's accurate, that's correct. And so this one has 30 questions, and there's a pass mark, but it's less important because you are being ranked on your score. So it's not only that you need to get the pass mark, but you need to perform really well. So the pass mark needs to be reached, but again, among the highest scoring candidates to be eligible to proceed to the next stage. Now, again, it does not relate to exam day. At the exam day, you do all the tests, but when they calculate the scores, that is when this one becomes important, because if you are not among the best performing candidates, basically you are not qualifying to be considered for the rest of the exam. Now, then there's an EU free text essay, which is essentially practically a written test. And also it has a pass-fail mark. And this, most importantly, it only tests a certain competence. And that competence is written communication. Now, written communication can be broken into multiple components. Anchors, for those who are interested in the psychological and the occupational psychological side of it. So there are certain components, metrics, if you will, within defining what good written communication skill actually means in this particular context. But one thing it's not a language test. It's not testing how fluent or eloquent in written expression you are. It's really about you providing a good flow, logical arguments, you understood the task, and more importantly, there's a background document that they will provide or will have provided by then 2 weeks before exam date. So you have about 2 weeks to 10 days to 2 weeks to actually familiarize yourself with that background document. That is often a European regulation or a policy document or a strategic document, but some form of EU official document. They tell all candidates that this is going to be the basis of your EU free text essay. You can get familiar with it. We at EU Training provide all sorts of training and analysis and various services around it to help your preparation. And then come exam day, when you have access to the very same document, and then you get an assignment. And in the assignment, you need to write perhaps a briefing or some sort of a draft note to the hierarchy, to someone higher up in the organization. So they give you a certain task on the basis of that document. And again, it's not testing how much you know about the field, about the area, and it's not testing your linguistic skills in a strict sense. Obviously, if it's full of typos, misuse words, the grammar is completely flawed, and the person reading it cannot really understand it, that's not going to help your written communication skills. But it's not about them testing how well you speak the language of your choice, the language 2. So having said that, you get 40 minutes for that, and it's obviously also on a computer with an interface with access to the document, and then they essentially evaluate that. And then comes the eligibility check. That's when they check based on those whose scores meet the predefined criteria. So they're not going to check anyone and everyone's score, but only those who have actually passed the certain tests that you have set. And then that's when they look at the documents. That's when they see, okay, all your submissions that you have provided by the 20th of March, that's when they will essentially look into those and decide whether you qualify or not. And then essentially the next final bit is the reserve list. So they create a reserve list, and from the reserve list, you become recruitable. You can be hired. Your status or your label is no longer candidate. You are a laureate. So you have won the reserve list lottery. I don't want to be cynical here. It's more than a lottery because it essentially based on all the efforts and the exams. But you are on the reserve list for a good reason, so you can be hired into a specific vacancy. And you can do many things proactively, and there are many things that the head of unit or the person in charge who has a hiring need has access to the database of these candidates, you being included there, and then reaching out to you and inviting you for an interview. So usually there's a kind of a get to know interview, or maybe there are 1 or 2 other candidates that they invite as well. And then they say, okay, I'm going to choose person A or person B. So this is essentially the full process. And the reserve list itself is public. So the names on the reserve list are made public. And again, there's more to say on how you can actually get a job once you're on the reserve list. a couple months ago, we recorded a brand new version of this particular topic webinar, which I had run many years ago. But like I said, a couple months ago, we did a new version of that, of how to get a job once you're on the reserve list. I think we gave a slightly different name that is accessible, because I share a lot of tips, including many related to AI and how you can use AI for more successful job applications and landing a job after having passed the competition. But again, that's a little bit beyond the scope of today's presentation, because we're focusing on the exam and getting to this point on the reserve list. And then there are indeed a few things you can do. And I see Sergio resonated with you that it's a lottery, but it's, let's say, a lottery with far higher probabilities than the lottery, because there's still so much you can do to secure a job once you're on the reserve list, and not just wait for fate and someone's goodwill to reach out to you, but you can proactively find vacancies and apply for those with great success. And this one, it's a little flow chart. We're not going to get into particular details, but it's good for reference, where of what are different steps of the entire process, where do they check the scores and eligibility and all the rest. And again, for all intents and purposes, this is not so needed for you to understand the big picture. It's really a flow chart, if you really want to get into it, of how the selection board effectively works and the numbers behind it. Your primary focus is passing the competition, passing the different exams. So how to get the job, how to get on the reserve list, and then get the job. Well, you want to practice. And again, 10, 12 weeks, feel free to challenge me on that. No problem. It can be a month, it can be 2 weeks, it can be 6 months. It entirely depends on where are you now? Where are you in your numerical reasoning skills? How familiar are you with the process? Do you know a lot about the topic related to the field, or certain bits you know a lot when it comes to data taxonomy, but you don't know much about GDPR for that matter, right? Like there could be blind spots in your knowledge, and looking at it in a broad, holistic way and see, okay, where do I need to brush up on? So give it sufficient time for each component of the overall competition. And then prepare, be consistent in your preparation, whether it's 1 hour per day, maybe 1 hour every 3 days, whatever it is, have a certain plan. And we have a preparation planner, and my colleagues will maybe kill me, because I don't know if it's offline or it's still active on our site, because we did a lot of tweaks and updates to it, but hopefully it's still available. And that is it's a free tool we put on the website. And again, I'm hoping it's up, but if not, then in a couple of weeks it will be, again, where you can create a certain study plan, or at least some sort of a roadmap for yourself on how to reach the goal of being as prepared as you can. And then methodology. There is a lot of methodology that you can look at, definitely on abstract verbal numerical reasoning, but there are many others. And staying persistent, like it's very similar to preparing for any important exam or sports competition or other, is the consistency, the regularity of having a roadmap and learning the methodology, which is so important. And doing simulation is certainly part of that. And we are here to support that in any way we can. So when you do practice questions, you can, or not just can, but perhaps you should, or you are encouraged to time your preparation, or not just the preparation, but the simulation. So create realistic scenarios and situations to the one at the exam, because you'll be stressed there. Your mind may not be 100% fully focused on it. So be more prepared, so at the exam under stress, you can still perform really well. And we provide workshops on methodology, instructor-led, in groups or individual, lots of webinars out there. Different formats, including coaching. And there are many webinars, like I said, so preparation mastery and written tests and reasoning skills, and lots and lots and lots of free resources. So you can find those on the site. We regularly do recaps of the available free resources. So all of that you can find on the site. And you may want to check out my books. So there's the EU test book, on which you see the 2025 edition. And then there's another one, again, for this competition, it's more kind of contextual, because it's about how the EU works, which is not a direct knowledge you need to know. So in all transparency, I could try to pitch it in any way we can, but I'd rather be very open and transparent about it, that this perhaps if you're less familiar with the EU as such, and you think it could help your EU free text essay of understanding European institutions, this book can be very handy. But otherwise, there's no direct testing of EU knowledge in this competition. And then we have the EU free text essay simulations and different sample materials that are on the website with personalized feedback, personalized evaluation. So that is something we offer even before the exam specific stuff comes out. So you can practice it as such. And before the exam, we do one such service where you can practice on the very material that EPSO releases. So 2 weeks before the exam when it's released, you can practice on the very same material, and then we provide you a personalized feedback. And what else? Yes, so the free resources, a little recap, but I see that many links are being pasted there. So those are listed. And then there is a Facebook community specifically for just competition, the data management and knowledge experts. So with that, there is a coupon that we're going to be sharing with you shortly. And there are a couple minutes left for me to answer a few other questions that have come in. So let me pick and choose very quickly. Tove, does teaching count as professional experience? Well, typically the rule, and again, rule of thumb is it needs to be paid and it needs to be formal. So if you are giving like kind of private classes to someone, that probably not, but if you do it as part of your job or your PhD or other profession, then it probably is. So there is that variable that I would need to understand more with your personal situation. Ricardo is asking, for example, a 5-year university degree, bachelor in economics, in which work experience bucket would fall? Well, the degree itself is the education bit. The question is the work experience, where you gained that. So did you work in which position, and is that broadly related to the topic of the competitions? Because if you, I don't know, if you work in a bank in totally different areas which are not related to the competition, it would not qualify as relevant work experience. All right. So again, many variables there. Dimitra is asking, I have proficient knowledge of 2 EU language. One is my mother tongue. What is your suggestion for the multiple choice quiz and the field related test? So yeah, if you have proficient of 2 EU language, again, the same rule applies that I mentioned briefly, where the one that is, let's say, you can passively take in information quickly. And perhaps one more thing that I didn't say, that you have the technical vocabulary, the jargon of this field. Because in some languages, maybe you speak really fluently, but you don't know the expressions of your field. So the field-related tests, you need to take that in a language where you understand the very nuanced technical expressions related to this particular area. So make sure you choose that, because if you studied this field in that language, probably that's the language you want to pick as language 2. All right, Vasiliki asking, if you're an IT business analyst, how can you prove experience in the field? Does it count since you deal with data, your data test accuracy? I guess it depends on your description of what your daily tasks are. And you want to make sure you spell it out and not leave it to the imagination of the selection board to say, well, here's my job title that I've been in for 3 years, and I let you guess what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, right? Like you want to provide, and the more formal official documents you can provide, the better, because kind of self-declarations may not be considered for that purpose. So again, you want to be as transparent and clear about the details as you can be. Erkan is asking, regarding study qualifications, mathematical engineering, eligible to apply? It's not listed by name. I mean, based on my immediate hunch, mathematical engineering sounds absolutely relevant and qualifies for this. Again, I decline the legal responsibility for what I'm saying, but I say it with the best intentions, and based on my immediate intuition, looks really like it's relevant, even if it's not specifically named. There's an ambiguous definition about the engineering degrees. Are only IT engineering degrees valid, or other engineering fields? Yeah, so that's a kind of question that you might want to ask directly to the selection board, because it doesn't relate to your personal situation. It relates to clarifying a certain part in the notice of competition. And sometimes what they do is they realize that that's a question that concerns more than one candidate, and it's a broad, the term needs to be specified. They might add a certain clarification or even a formal legal addendum to the notice of competition to say, well, this also is included. So I would encourage you to send a message to EPSO and the selection board to clarify this particular angle. When can we expect the test to take place? Before March, after March? Oh, I can take my crystal ball. Very hard to tell, really hard to tell, because it also depends on the new provider being onboarded and coming in and working. Really very difficult to estimate. Yeah, could be February, could be March, but given that the March 20 deadline to submit documents, yeah, probably around that time. If you really press me hard, I would probably say likely is rather March. Maybe one or two before we close. Okay, so Rita saying no preparation planner. So I apologize for teasing you with this wonderful tool, which we had to take off because of some technical issues, but we're working hard to that we can put it back. It was a nice, handy, free tool where you can put in certain variables. But again, I don't want to say more about a tool that is not available right now, but as soon as it's available, you're going to hear about it and we'll make it known. Then Flavia, do you have any idea of the new testing platform? Will yours be adapted? So ours will be definitely adapted as soon as we see reliable public information about what it looks like, or if it's any different from the current one. We're definitely going to work hard to adapt ours to replicate that. And when I don't think it's going to be very different, honestly, because these interfaces are there are not so many things you can change in it, right? Like you have the test, you have the multiple choice quiz, the small yet still consequential things do matter. Do you have a scratch pad? What does the on-screen calculator look like? Those kind of things, but not beyond that. So I don't expect any major user interface innovations in that regard. If one passes this competition, can we apply for other vacancies besides this one? Well, this is not really technically a vacancy. So you pass this competition, and based on this, you will have certain opportunities, vacancies. But let's say if there's a translator position, you cannot apply for that, despite meeting perhaps all the criteria, but that's a very different kind of thing. And it's also an internal agreement inside the institutions that they publish this competition, there is a reserve list, and then there is a fairly specific idea of the vacancies into which you can be hired, and not something totally different elsewhere. Okay, maybe two more questions before we close. Here's one of Fion, I think. I'm currently in the process of getting my EU citizenship. I will not be ready until approximately end of February, beginning of March. Can I still continue with the application? Oh, first time I hear this. I mean, that sort of situation where you want to apply, but I suspect, and again, I would need to double check, but I suspect you need to have the EU citizenship at the time of application. That's my immediate hunch. It would need to be cross-checked, double-checked, but look into it. It should be in a notice of competition. And if not, again, I encourage you to send a message to EPSO to clarify that, at which point they check or you need to meet the criterion of being an EU citizen. And then Rachel, a colleague, took the AST3 communications exam recently. In the abstract test, didn't come up. System took her directly from verbal to numerical. Will she be disqualified? Well, if it's not her fault, she immediately need to have indicated that. If there's a technical problem with the test interface, then it needs to be immediately signaled to the test provider to say, hey, it's not my problem. There was a technical issue. I don't want to be disadvantaged because a fault outside of my own computer and ecosystem actually prevented me from sitting that particular test. So with that, we will close here. I know that there are a few other questions. We'll try to find a shape or a form in which we can answer those, maybe in a blog post or similar on the website. I thank you so much for being here today. And thanks to Rita and Esther and Elmi and everyone else who was involved in putting this together. Thank you so much for you for having spent the past 60 minutes with me. Hopefully this was informative, this was helpful. We are here to assist your path into the EU institutions, your European career. Wishing you luck, wishing you perseverance and strength to go through this process. Take it seriously. A lot of people are interested in these wonderful opportunities. So once you put your mind to it, then have a plan and go for it. So with those words, thank you so much for being here, and the rest will be sent as promised in due course. Have a nice day.